Ma'am, you're in the wrong section. This lounge is for first-class passengers only, not people like you. The words sliced through the hushed ambiance of the Skyline Airways
You really
premium
think you can
diamond
handle
lounge
this?
like a blade
Let me show
through
you how
silk.
it's done.
Brandon Mitchell stood over the woman in the black
We
hoodie
need
with his
food. We need
arms
this
crossed
now.
and
We
his
need this
smile
now.
as fake
No
as
delays.
His authority was about to prove hollow. His voice carried just enough volume for nearby passengers to turn and stare at champagne flutes, pausing mid-sip their quiet Christmas Eve conversations, grinding to an uncomfortable halt. What Brandon didn't know was that in exactly 18 minutes, the woman he was trying to humiliate would fire him and restructure his entire world. But we'll get to that. First, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from this Christmas week? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe in justice for workplace discrimination, hit that subscribe button, because this story will remind you why respect should never be negotiable. The woman looked up from her tablet slowly, deliberately. Her eyes were calm, intelligent, holding secrets that Brandon Mitchell couldn't begin to comprehend. She wore a simple black hoodie, faded jeans, and white sneakers that had seen better days. To Brandon, she was everything wrong with modern air travel. To the world, she was about to become a symbol of quiet dignity, triumphing over loud ignorance. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady and controlled. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just a simple request for clarification that somehow carried more authority than Brandon's bluster. Brandon straightened his tie, a purely reflexive gesture he performed whenever he felt the need to assert his dominance. Around them, the Diamond Lounge continued its choreographed dance of privilege. Crystal glasses clinked against marble tables. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. The scent of expensive leather mixed with fresh coffee and the faint fragrance of the massive Christmas tree that dominated the center of the space, its golden ornaments reflecting the soft lighting like tiny suns. "I said you're in the wrong section," Brandon repeated, his tone growing sharper. "This is a premium lounge with a $12,000 annual membership fee. Our guests pay for a certain atmosphere, a certain standard." The woman closed her tablet carefully, giving Brandon her full attention. She didn't stand, didn't raise her voice, didn't show any of the reactions he expected. Instead, she simply asked, "And which standard am I failing to meet?" It was a reasonable question, a logical question, the kind of question that should have made Brandon pause and reconsider his approach. Instead, it made him angrier. Here was someone who should be apologizing, should be gathering her things in embarrassment, should be scurrying away to whatever discount terminal gate she belonged to. Instead, she was questioning him. In front of other passengers, in front of his staff. "Look around you," Brandon said, gesturing broadly at the lounge. "Everyone here understands the dress code. Business-appropriate attire. Professional appearance. You look like you're waiting for a bus, not boarding a first-class flight." The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or perhaps just the weary familiarity of someone who'd had this conversation before. "I have a first-class ticket," she said simply. "Then I'm sure there's been some mistake," Brandon replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps you upgraded using miles, or maybe someone gave you their ticket. Either way, the lounge has certain expectations that go beyond just having a boarding pass." Around them, the carefully orchestrated atmosphere of the Diamond Lounge began to shift. Conversations grew quieter as more passengers turned their attention to the unfolding scene. A few people pulled out their phones, not obviously, but with the casual awareness that something potentially significant was happening. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a boarding pass and passport. She handed them to Brandon without a word. He took them, expecting to find some discount carrier ticket or a coach seat that had been mistakenly processed. Instead, he found himself holding a first-class boarding pass for Skyline Airways Flight 447 to London Seat 1A, and a passport that read Dr. Victoria Harrington. Brandon's smile faltered for just a moment. "Doctor, first class, Seat 1A. It was all legitimate, annoyingly so. He handed the documents back with a slight sneer. "Thank you, Dr. Harrington," he said, putting a condescending emphasis on the title. "Everything seems to be in order with your ticket. However, as I mentioned, we do have certain atmosphere standards here in the Diamond Lounge." Dr. Victoria Harrington accepted her documents back and placed them carefully in her bag. When she looked up at Brandon again, there was something different in her expression. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of quiet resolve that he completely failed to recognize. "Mr. she began. "Mitchell. Brandon Mitchell. I'm the manager of this lounge, Mr. Mitchell." Victoria said, her voice remaining perfectly level. "I think you're making a mistake." Brandon laughed, a sharp sound that carried across the marble floors. "The only mistake here, Dr. Harrington is thinking that having a first-class ticket automatically qualifies you for this environment. We cater to business professionals, executives, people who understand the importance of maintaining certain standards." "I understand," Victoria said quietly. "And you're absolutely certain you want to continue down this path?" There was something in her tone that should have given Brandon pause. A warning wrapped in silk, a gentle suggestion that maybe, just maybe, he was walking into territory he couldn't handle. But Brandon Mitchell had spent 5 years working his way up from gate agent to lounge manager, and he'd learned that maintaining authority meant never backing down, especially not in front of witnesses. "I'm certain," he said firmly, "and I'm going to need you to gather your things and find somewhere more appropriate to wait for your flight." Victoria Harrington nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this response. She picked up her phone and sent a quick text message. Then she looked back at Brandon Mitchell, and for just a moment he caught a glimpse of something in her eyes that made him uncomfortable. Not fear or anger or embarrassment, but something that looked almost like pity. 18 minutes, she said quietly. "What?" "Nothing, Mr. Mitchell. Nothing at all." The skyline. Airways Premium Diamond Lounge occupied nearly 8,000 square feet of prime real estate in Miami International Airport's Terminal C. It was a temple to modern luxury, a carefully curated space designed to make its members feel like they belonged to an exclusive club of global elites. The entrance alone cost more than most people's annual salaries to design, with its hand-carved wooden doors and brushed steel signage that caught and reflected the Florida sunshine streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside the lounge was divided into several distinct areas, each serving a specific purpose in the choreography of first-class comfort. The main seating area featured oversized leather chairs arranged in intimate conversational groupings, each cluster positioned to provide maximum privacy while still offering panoramic views of the runway. The business center hummed quietly with the sound of keyboards and hushed phone conversations, while the dining area served cuisine that rivaled five-star restaurants in both quality and presentation. But it was the Christmas decorations that truly set the scene on this December 23rd afternoon. The centerpiece was a 12-foot Norwegian spruce Christmas tree decorated with handcrafted golden ornaments, each one unique and worth more than most people spent on their entire holiday shopping. Garland woven with white lights draped elegantly along the windows, and tasteful holiday music provided a subtle soundtrack to the conversations about quarterly earnings and merger acquisitions that filled the space. This was Brandon Mitchell's kingdom, and he ruled it with the iron fist of someone who had clawed his way up from the bottom. 5 years ago, he'd been a gate agent dealing with delayed flights and angry passengers. He'd worked double shifts, covered for sick colleagues, and kissed up to every supervisor who might help him climb the corporate ladder. When the position of assistant manager in the Diamond Lounge opened up, he'd applied with the desperation of someone who saw it as his ticket to a better life. And it had been. The promotion came with a salary increase that allowed him to move out of his studio apartment and into a one-bedroom with a view. It came with respect from colleagues who had previously treated him like furniture. Most importantly, it came with proximity to power, the ability to rub shoulders with the kind of people he'd only read about in Forbes magazine. Over the past 18 months, since his promotion to full manager, Brandon had cultivated what he believed was a sophisticated understanding of luxury service. He studied the way wealthy clients dressed, spoke, and carried themselves. He memorized wine pairings and learned to recognize expensive watches and handbags. He developed what he considered an eye for quality, an ability to spot at a glance whether someone belonged in his carefully curated environment. It was this expertise that made Victoria Harrington's presence so jarring to him. Everything about her violated his understanding of how first-class passengers should present themselves. The hoodie was some generic brand he couldn't identify. The jeans were faded and comfortable-looking rather than designer and tailored. The sneakers showed actual wear scuff marks that spoke of real use rather than fashion statement. But if Brandon had looked closer, if he'd been less focused on surface appearances and more attuned to the subtle indicators of true wealth, he might have noticed the details that mattered. Victoria's tablet was the latest model, so new it hadn't been released to the public yet. Her phone case was custom leather handcrafted and monogrammed with initials that matched her passport. The bag at her feet was unassuming but bore the subtle markings of a brand that only created pieces for a very select clientele. More importantly, if Brandon had been paying attention to behavior rather than clothing, he might have noticed the way other staff members had greeted Victoria when she entered the lounge. Isabella Garcia, the senior concierge, had offered a genuine smile and asked if Dr. Harrington needed anything specific for her flight. Amanda Foster, the assistant manager, had personally ensured that Victoria's preferred seating area was available and that the Wi-Fi connection was optimal for her work. These weren't the interactions of staff members meeting a random first-class passenger for the first time. They were the careful courtesies extended to someone familiar, someone important, someone who deserved special attention. But Brandon, so focused on his own authority and so blinded by his surface-level judgments, had missed every single clue. Victoria Harrington had founded Skyline Airways 12 years ago with a $50,000 loan and a business plan that most investors had dismissed as overly ambitious. The aviation industry, they told her, was too established, too competitive, too dominated by legacy carriers for a startup to succeed. They were wrong. Through a combination of innovative technology, exceptional service, and an unwavering focus on customer experience, Victoria had built Skyline into an $8.2 billion company that consistently ranked at the top of customer satisfaction surveys. Her success hadn't come without cost. The long hours, the constant travel, the weight of responsibility for thousands of employees and millions of passengers had taken their toll. She'd missed family holidays, skipped vacations, and pushed herself to the edge of exhaustion more times than she cared to remember. But every sacrifice had been worth it when she thought about her parents. Both lost in a commercial aviation accident when she was 22, and her promise to make flying safer and more dignified for everyone. That promise was why she was sitting in the Diamond Lounge today, dressed down and anonymous, conducting one of her unannounced quality assessments. Every quarter, Victoria made it a point to experience her airline as a regular passenger would. She booked flights under her real name, but without any corporate identification. She observed how staff treated customers, how policies were implemented, and how the culture she'd worked so hard to build actually translated into day-to-day operations. Usually, these undercover visits went smoothly. Her employees were well-trained, professional, and committed to the values she'd instilled in the company. But every so often, she encountered someone like Brandon Mitchell. Someone who had somehow slipped through the cracks of the hiring process and now represented everything she'd spent 12 years trying to eliminate from the travel experience. As Victoria sat in her chair responding to Brandon's increasingly aggressive suggestions that she leave, she wasn't thinking about revenge or humiliation. She was thinking about every passenger who had ever been made to feel unwelcome in a space they'd paid to access. Every customer who had been judged by their appearance rather than treated with the dignity they deserved. Every person who had walked away from an interaction with her company feeling diminished rather than valued. Brandon Mitchell was about to become a teaching moment not just for him, but for every employee at Skyline Airways who might be tempted to let their personal biases override their professional obligations. The lesson was simple in Victoria Harrington's company: respect wasn't negotiable, dignity wasn't optional, and discrimination had consequences that extended far beyond a single uncomfortable conversation. The Christmas tree lights twinkled merrily as the confrontation continued to unfold, but the holiday spirit in the Diamond Lounge was about to encounter a very different kind of gift. The gift of accountability, the gift of justice, and, for Brandon Mitchell, the gift of learning that sometimes the most important lessons come wrapped in packages we never see coming. Carlos Mendoza had been filming content for his TikTok account for over an hour, documenting what he'd planned to call Christmas Week Luxury Travel Vibes. With 3.2 million followers hanging on his every post, the 29-year-old influencer had built a career out of showcasing the finer things in life, from five-star restaurants to premium airport lounges. Today's content was supposed to be a simple review of the Diamond Lounge's holiday decorations and champagne selection. But Carlos had developed an instinct for when a situation was about to become something bigger than planned. 5 years of creating viral content had taught him to recognize the subtle signs that preceded explosive moments. The way conversations quieted when something interesting started happening. The shift in body language when people sensed conflict. The particular quality of tension that preceded the kind of content that could generate millions of views in a matter of hours. When he noticed Brandon Mitchell approaching the woman in the hoodie, Carlos's content creator instincts kicked in. This wasn't going to be a routine customer service interaction. The manager's body language was too aggressive, his expression too predatory. Carlos casually adjusted his phone's position, switching from filming the Christmas decorations to capturing what was beginning to unfold across the lounge. At first, he thought he might be documenting a simple case of mistaken identity, or perhaps a minor policy misunderstanding. But as Brandon's voice grew sharper and more condescending, Carlos realized he was witnessing something much more significant. This wasn't a customer service issue. This was discrimination happening in real time, and it was happening in one of the most expensive airport lounges in the country. Carlos had seen enough viral discrimination videos to recognize the signs. The way Brandon looked the woman up and down before approaching her. The tone of voice that carried just enough volume for other passengers to hear. The assumption that someone who didn't look a certain way couldn't possibly belong in an exclusive space. It was textbook bias, and it was unfolding right in front of his camera. Across the lounge, Jennifer Walsh was having her own moment of recognition. The 34-year-old tech journalist had been scrolling through her laptop trying to finish an article about emerging trends in aviation technology before her flight to Seattle, where she planned to spend Christmas with her family. But the conversation near the Christmas tree had caught her attention, and her journalist instincts were starting to fire. Jennifer had spent 8 years covering the tech industry, which meant she'd seen plenty of discrimination up close. The venture capital meetings where women's ideas were dismissed without consideration. The conferences where people of color were assumed to be servers rather than speakers. The networking events where someone's value was determined by their appearance rather than their accomplishments. She'd written about these incidents, interviewed victims, and called out perpetrators, but she'd rarely had the opportunity to document discrimination as it actually happened. But that's exactly what was unfolding in front of her right now. Jennifer opened her laptop's camera and began recording simultaneously, starting a LinkedIn Live session that would broadcast to her network of technology professionals and aviation industry contacts. Her audience might be smaller than Carlos's TikTok following, but it was highly influential, filled with the kind of people who could turn a single incident into industry-wide conversations about corporate culture and customer treatment. Near the windows overlooking the runway, Antonio Rivera was having the most complicated reaction of anyone in the lounge. The 26-year-old pilot had been with Skyline Airways for 3 years, working his way up from regional routes to international flights. He was off duty today, catching a flight to Denver to spend Christmas with his girlfriend's family, but he'd stopped by the Diamond Lounge to grab coffee and check the weather for tomorrow's return flight. Antonio recognized Victoria Harrington immediately. Every pilot at Skyline knew their CEO not just from corporate communications and annual meetings, but from her habit of visiting cockpits during pre-flight checks and asking detailed questions about aircraft performance and safety protocols. Victoria wasn't the kind of CEO who stayed locked in an executive suite. She knew her planes, knew her routes, and knew many of her employees by name. But watching Brandon Mitchell's aggressive approach to Dr. Harrington put Antonio in an impossible position. Company policy was clear about not interfering with management decisions in customer service situations. As an off-duty employee, he had no authority to intervene in lounge operations. But as someone who understood exactly who Victoria Harrington was and what she meant to the company, he also knew that Brandon was making a catastrophic mistake that could have consequences far beyond a single uncomfortable interaction. Antonio pulled out his phone and began texting his supervisor, trying to find a way to alert someone in management about what was happening without directly violating protocol. But even as he typed, he could see that the situation was escalating beyond the point where a quiet intervention might solve the problem. Behind the reception desk, Amanda Foster was experiencing her own crisis of conscience. The 24-year-old assistant manager had been working in the Diamond Lounge for 8 months, and she'd developed a keen appreciation for the diverse range of passengers who held first-class tickets. She'd learned that wealth and status came in many different packages, and that making assumptions based on appearance was the fastest way to embarrass yourself and the company. Amanda had noticed Victoria when she entered the lounge, and something about the woman had seemed familiar, though she couldn't quite place where she might have seen her before. But she'd treated Victoria with the same courteous professionalism she extended to all first-class passengers, ensuring she had everything she needed for a comfortable wait before her flight. Now, watching Brandon's aggressive approach, Amanda felt sick to her stomach. She'd seen her boss make these kinds of judgments before targeting passengers who didn't fit his narrow definition of what first-class travelers should look like. She'd watched him find excuses to question black passengers more frequently than white ones, to demand additional verification from people who spoke with accents to create barriers that didn't exist in actual company policy. Amanda had reported these incidents to regional management twice in the past 6 months, but her complaints had been dismissed as misunderstandings or differences in management style. Brandon was good at covering his tracks, at making his discrimination look like legitimate policy enforcement. But this time felt different. This time he was being so obvious, so public, that there would be no way to explain away his actions as anything other than what they were. Isabella Garcia, the senior concierge, was the only staff member who knew exactly who Victoria Harrington was. The 31-year-old had been with Skyline Airways for 7 years, long enough to remember when Victoria used to make regular visits to different facilities to meet with employees and observe operations. Isabella had been working at the gate when Victoria had personally thanked her for helping a family with special needs children navigate a complicated connection. But Isabella also understood that Victoria's presence in the lounge today wasn't a scheduled visit. Dr. Harrington was dressed casually, traveling without the usual entourage that accompanied executive visits, and she'd checked in using standard passenger protocols rather than corporate procedures. This was clearly one of Victoria's famous undercover assessments, and Brandon was failing spectacularly. Isabella wanted to intervene, wanted to warn Brandon that he was making a massive mistake, but company protocol was strict about maintaining chain of command in customer service situations. As a concierge, she couldn't override a manager's decisions, even when those decisions were clearly wrong. All she could do was document what was happening and hope that someone with more authority would step in before the situation became irreparable. Kevin Thompson, the security liaison, was the only person in the lounge who seemed completely oblivious to the gravity of what was unfolding. The 27-year-old had been hired 6 months ago based primarily on his eagerness to please management, rather than any particular expertise in customer service or conflict resolution. Kevin saw Brandon's aggressive approach to the passenger as an opportunity to demonstrate his loyalty and support for lounge management. When Brandon's voice grew louder and more confrontational, Kevin moved closer to the conversation, positioning himself as backup in case the situation required additional authority. He didn't question whether Brandon's actions were appropriate or justified. He simply accepted that if the manager was challenging a passenger, then that passenger must be creating some kind of problem that required resolution. Kevin's unquestioning support for Brandon's actions would soon prove to be another catastrophic misreading of the situation. But in the moment, as he stood ready to assist in removing an inappropriate passenger from the Diamond Lounge, he felt confident that he was doing his job and supporting his supervisor. The stage was set. The witnesses were in position. The cameras were rolling. And none of them, except for Isabella Garcia, had any idea that they were about to watch the destruction of Brandon Mitchell's career, courtesy of the woman he was trying so hard to humiliate. The Christmas lights continued to twinkle. The jazz music continued to play, and the 18-minute countdown that Victoria had mentioned was ticking steadily toward zero, Dr. Harrington. Brandon said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he reserved for passengers he considered beneath the Diamond Lounge's standards. I'm sure you understand that exclusive venues like this one require a certain level of presentation. We're not trying to be difficult, but our members have expectations about the atmosphere they're paying for. Victoria looked up from her tablet, her expression remaining perfectly neutral. She'd heard variations of this speech before, usually delivered by people who mistook authority for intelligence and policy for permission to discriminate. And what specific presentation requirements am I failing to meet, Mr. Mitchell? It was a simple question, but it hit Brandon like a trap he hadn't seen coming. The truth was that Skyline Airways had no dress code for lounge access. First-class passengers and Diamond members could wear anything they wanted, as long as it wasn't offensive or disruptive. Brandon's standards were entirely his own invention, a collection of personal biases he'd elevated to the level of company policy in his own mind. Well, Brandon said, fumbling for a response that would sound official without being specifically provable, it's more about the overall impression. The Diamond Lounge caters to business travelers, executives, people who understand the importance of maintaining professional appearance even during leisure travel. I see, Victoria replied. And you've determined that my appearance is unprofessional. Brandon gestured at her outfit with the kind of dismissive wave he'd seen wealthy passengers use when dealing with service staff they considered incompetent. Let's be honest, Dr. Harrington. You're wearing a hoodie and sneakers in a premium lounge. Our other guests are dressed appropriately for the environment they're in. Victoria glanced around the lounge, taking in the other passengers Brandon was using as his standard for appropriate dress. At the nearest table, a man in his 60s wore khakis and a polo shirt while working on his laptop. Near the windows, a woman in her 40s was dressed in yoga pants and a university sweatshirt reading a paperback novel. In the business center, a young man wore jeans and a button-down shirt that looked like it had come straight from a discount retailer. I'm curious, Mr. Mitchell? Victoria said, her voice remaining calm despite the growing absurdity of the situation. Have you approached any of those other passengers about their attire? Brandon's jaw tightened. The question highlighted the obvious inconsistency in his approach, but admitting that would undermine his authority and make him look like exactly what he was, a middle manager on a power trip. That's different, he said. Those passengers understand the environment. They don't what Victoria asked, and there was something in her tone that made several nearby passengers stop their conversations and pay attention. They fit, Brandon said finally, and the word hung in the air like a confession. Carlos Mendoza's camera captured the moment perfectly. The way Brandon's face flushed when he realized what he'd just admitted. The way Victoria's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes that suggested Brandon had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The way other passengers began pulling out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Jennifer Walsh adjusted her laptop screen to better frame the conversation, her LinkedIn Live audience growing rapidly as viewers shared the stream with their own networks. The comments section was already filling with outrage and disbelief as tech industry professionals watched a clear case of discrimination unfold in real time. Fit Victoria repeated, and the single word carried enough weight to make Brandon squirm. And what criteria do you use to determine whether someone fits? Mr. Mitchell? Brandon realized he was digging himself deeper, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He'd built his entire identity around being the kind of person who belonged in exclusive spaces, who could recognize quality and maintain standards. Admitting that he was wrong about this passenger would mean admitting that his judgment was flawed, that his carefully cultivated expertise was nothing more than bias disguised as discernment. Experience, he said, straightening his tie again. 5 years of managing premium customer experiences. I can tell at a glance whether someone understands the expectations of this environment. Victoria nodded slowly as if she were genuinely considering his explanation. And based on your 5 years of experience, you've concluded that I don't understand expectations? Exactly, Brandon said, feeling like he was finally getting his point across. The Diamond Lounge isn't just about having a first-class ticket. It's about appreciating the culture, the atmosphere, the level of service we provide. It's about showing respect for the other passengers who've chosen to invest in this experience. Respect, Victoria said, and the word seemed to echo across the marble floors. You're concerned about respect? Absolutely. Our members deserve an environment that reflects their investment in premium travel. Victoria set her tablet on the table beside her and looked directly at Brandon. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that nearby passengers had to lean in to hear her, but clear enough that every word carried with perfect precision. Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to give you one opportunity to reconsider your approach here. Something in her tone made Amanda Foster look up sharply from the reception desk. Isabella Garcia stopped what she was doing and moved closer to the conversation. Even Kevin Thompson, dense as he was, seemed to sense that the dynamic in the lounge had shifted. But Brandon Mitchell, blinded by his own sense of righteous authority, heard only a passenger trying to negotiate with his clearly stated policy. In his mind, any backing down now would be seen as weakness by the other guests and his own staff. He'd made his position clear, and he was going to stick with it. Dr. Harrington, he said, his voice growing louder and more official sounding. I appreciate that you may not be familiar with our standards here, but the Diamond Lounge maintains certain expectations that are non-negotiable. I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and find a more appropriate place to wait for your flight. The lounge fell silent. Even the soft jazz music seemed to pause, waiting to see how Victoria would respond to what amounted to an order to leave a space she'd paid to access. Victoria reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts for a moment, then placed a call. When someone answered, she spoke quietly but clearly enough for Brandon to hear. Samantha, it's Victoria. I need you to initiate Protocol 7. We have a situation at MIA Terminal C. Brandon frowned. Protocol 7 sounded official, but he assumed it was some kind of legal threat. Passengers always thought they could intimidate service staff by mentioning lawyers or corporate contacts. He'd dealt with these empty threats before. Are you calling your lawyer, Dr. Harrington? He asked with a smirk. Because I can assure you that lawyers won't change our lounge policies. Victoria ended her call and looked back at Brandon. Mr. Mitchell, that wasn't my lawyer. Then who was it? Victoria smiled for the first time since their conversation began. But it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the kind of smile someone wore when they were about to reveal information that would change everything. That was my executive assistant. And you now have approximately 15 minutes before your life becomes very, very complicated. Brandon laughed, but it sounded forced. Are you threatening me, Dr. Harrington? No, Mr. Mitchell. I'm not threatening you. I'm simply stating a fact. You've been given multiple opportunities to reconsider your position, and you've chosen to double down on a course of action that you don't fully understand the consequences of. What consequences? Brandon demanded. You're a passenger, a customer. You don't get to dictate lounge policies just because you don't like being held to the same standards as everyone else. Victoria stood up slowly, smoothing down her hoodie and gathering her belongings. For a moment, Brandon thought he'd won, that she was finally going to leave and allow him to restore order to his domain. Instead, Victoria looked around the lounge, taking in the Christmas decorations, the comfortable seating, the panoramic windows, and the various passengers who were now openly staring at their conversation. When she spoke, her voice carried across the entire space. This is a beautiful lounge, Mr. Mitchell. I'm very proud of what we've built here. It would be a shame to see it run by someone who doesn't understand what it's supposed to represent. Brandon's confusion was evident on his face. What we've built? What are you talking about? But Victoria was already walking toward the entrance, her phone buzzing with incoming calls and messages. Behind her, she left a trail of questions and confusion that would soon explode into something much larger than Brandon Mitchell could handle. The countdown was accelerating, and Brandon didn't even know the clock was ticking. Brandon Mitchell watched Victoria Harrington walk toward the lounge entrance with a mixture of satisfaction and lingering unease. On one hand, he'd successfully maintained the Diamond Lounge's standards and removed a passenger who clearly didn't understand the environment she was in. On the other hand, there had been something about her final comments that bothered him, something he couldn't quite shake. But before he could analyze Victoria's parting words further, she stopped near the entrance and turned back toward the lounge. She wasn't leaving. Instead, she was settling into one of the chairs near the reception desk, pulling out her phone and beginning what looked like a series of very serious phone calls. Brandon felt his authority being challenged in the most direct way possible. He'd told a passenger to leave, and she was not only refusing to comply, but making herself even more visible by positioning herself in the busiest part of the lounge. Other passengers were watching, his staff was watching, and his credibility as a manager was on the line. Excuse me, Dr. Harrington, Brandon said, approaching her new position with Kevin Thompson trailing behind him like an eager puppy. I thought I made it clear that you needed to find somewhere else to wait for your flight. Victoria looked up from her phone call, covering the mouthpiece with her hand. I'm sorry, could you repeat that I'm in the middle of something rather important? The dismissiveness in her tone infuriated Brandon. This was his lounge, his domain, and this passenger was treating him like he was an inconvenience rather than the authority figure he clearly was. I said you need to leave. This isn't a debate or a negotiation. You've been asked to go, and I expect you to comply. Victoria finished her call and gave Brandon her full attention. Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you one more time to reconsider your position. Are you absolutely certain you want to continue down this path? I'm certain, Brandon replied, his voice growing louder. And I'm beginning to think this isn't just about dress code. This is about following instructions and respecting authority. When a manager asks you to do something, you do it. Around them, the atmosphere in the Diamond Lounge was shifting dramatically. Carlos Mendoza had abandoned any pretense of filming a casual lounge review and was now openly documenting what was clearly becoming a significant confrontation. His TikTok audience had grown to over 50,000 live viewers, with comments flooding in from around the world as people shared the stream and tried to understand what they were witnessing. Jennifer Walsh's LinkedIn live session was having an even more dramatic impact. Her audience of tech industry professionals and aviation executives was watching in real time as a customer service situation spiraled completely out of control. The comments section was filled with people identifying themselves as Skyline Airways employees, partners, and industry insiders, all expressing shock and disbelief at what they were seeing. This is insane, typed one commenter who identified herself as a Skyline regional manager. That's not how we train our staff to handle passenger interactions. I work for a competing airline, wrote another, and even I'm embarrassed by this. Someone needs to shut this down immediately. Has anyone contacted Skyline Corporate? Asked a third. This is going to be a PR nightmare if it gets out of control. But the most ominous comment came from someone whose profile indicated he worked in Skyline's legal department. Oh my God. Someone needs to tell that manager to stop talking, right now, before this gets worse. Antonio Rivera was no longer concerned about company protocol. He'd sent 3 increasingly urgent text messages to his supervisor trying to alert someone in management about what was happening in the Diamond Lounge. The responses he'd received were frustrating in their bureaucratic tone. Not your concern, his supervisor had texted back. Lounge management handles passenger issues. You don't understand, Antonio had replied. This is Dr. Harrington, the CEO. She's being asked to leave her own lounge. But his supervisor's response was delayed, probably because he was checking to confirm what Antonio was telling him. Meanwhile, the situation in the lounge was escalating beyond the point where a quiet intervention could solve the problem. Amanda Foster felt sick to her stomach as she watched Brandon dig himself deeper into a hole that she was beginning to suspect was much larger than anyone realized. There was something familiar about Dr. Harrington, something that nagged at the edge of her memory. She'd seen that face before, but not as a random passenger. Somewhere official, somewhere important. Amanda pulled out her phone and did a quick Google search for Dr. Victoria Harrington. The results made her blood run cold. CEO and founder of Skyline Airways. Net worth estimated at $2.3 billion. Named one of the most influential women in aviation by Forbes magazine. And there in the image search results was the same face that was currently being asked to leave the Diamond Lounge by Amanda's boss. Oh no, Amanda whispered to herself. Oh no, oh no, oh no. Isabella Garcia had given up on maintaining professional distance. She approached Amanda's desk and spoke in an urgent whisper. We need to stop this right now. Mr. Mitchell is making a terrible mistake. I know, Amanda whispered back, showing Isabella her phone screen. Look. Isabella's eyes widened as she saw the search results. Madre de Dios, we have to tell him. Tell him what? That he's trying to kick the owner of the airline out of her own lounge. He'll never believe us. And even if he does, it's too late. Look around. Everyone is filming. Indeed, the Diamond Lounge had transformed into an impromptu film studio. Carlos's TikTok stream was approaching 100,000 live viewers. Jennifer's LinkedIn session was being shared across professional networks faster than she could track. Other passengers were filming with their phones, some openly, others discreetly, but all of them capturing what was clearly becoming a significant incident. But Brandon Mitchell focused entirely on what he saw as a challenge to his authority, was oblivious to the growing digital audience watching his every move. He was so convinced of his own righteousness, so certain that he was protecting the lounge's standards, that he couldn't see the trap he was walking into with every word. Dr. Harrington Brandon said, his voice now loud enough to carry across the entire lounge. I'm going to give you one final opportunity to gather your things and leave voluntarily. If you refuse, I'll be forced to call airport security to have you removed. The threat hung in the air like a thundercloud. Several passengers audibly gasped. Carlos zoomed in on Victoria's face, capturing her expression as she processed what Brandon had just said. The TikTok comments exploded with outrage and disbelief. Did he just threaten to have her arrested, typed one viewer? This is discrimination, plain and simple, wrote another. Someone needs to screen record this because this dude is about to get fired. Predicted a third, not realizing how prophetic that comment would prove to be. Victoria Harrington stood up slowly and the lounge fell silent. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how she would respond to what amounted to an ultimatum. Would she back down? Would she escalate? Would she reveal whatever trump card she'd been holding throughout this increasingly surreal confrontation? Instead, Victoria did something that no one expected. She smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't an amused smile. It was the kind of smile that someone wore when they were about to reveal information that would change everything, the kind of expression that appeared on someone's face when they realized their opponent had just made a fatal error. "Mr. Mitchell," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the marble floors with crystal clarity, "you are absolutely certain you want to call airport security to have me removed from this lounge?" "If that's what it takes," Brandon replied, his confidence bolstered by what he interpreted as Victoria's final surrender. "Our members deserve better than this disruption. And you're completely confident in your authority to make that decision?" "Completely." Victoria nodded as if she'd expected that answer. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim leather folder that none of the witnesses had noticed before. "In that case, Mr. Mitchell, I think it's time we clarified a few things about authority in this lounge." She opened the folder carefully, revealing documents that she arranged on the table beside her like a poker player laying down a royal flush. "Before you call security, I think you should know exactly who you're having removed." Brandon stepped closer, trying to see what Victoria was showing him. The documents looked official corporate, but he couldn't make out the details from his position. "What is this supposed to prove?" "Take a look," Victoria said, gesturing to the papers. "I think you'll find them illuminating." Brandon picked up the first document and began to read. His face went pale as he processed what he was seeing. It was a corporate identification badge for Skyline Airways, complete with photo and security clearance information. The name read Dr. Victoria Harrington, Chief Executive Officer, but that couldn't be right. The CEO of Skyline Airways was some corporate executive who lived in boardrooms and attended shareholder meetings, not someone who wore hoodies and sat in airport lounges like a regular passenger. Brandon picked up the second document. It was a letter of corporate authorization signed by the Skyline Airways Board of Directors, giving Dr. Victoria Harrington full operational authority over all company facilities and personnel. The letterhead was official. The signatures were genuine, and the implications were becoming terrifyingly clear. The third document was a stock certificate showing Victoria Harrington's ownership stake in Skyline Airways, 63%. A controlling interest in the company that employed Brandon owned the lounge he managed and operated the flight she was supposed to take to London. Brandon's hands shook as he set the documents back on the table. Around him, the Diamond Lounge had fallen into complete silence. Even the Christmas music seemed to have stopped, as if the sound system itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Brandon's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "You're the CEO." "Yes," Victoria said simply. "I am." The words hit the lounge like a shockwave. Carlos's camera captured the moment perfectly, the exact second when Brandon Mitchell realized that he hadn't been asserting authority over a random passenger. He'd been trying to humiliate the person who owned everything around him, including his job. Jennifer's LinkedIn audience exploded with comments as tech industry professionals and aviation executives realized they were watching the most spectacular case of corporate comeuppance in recent memory. The stream was being shared across social media platforms faster than the analytics could track. But for Brandon Mitchell, the social media storm was the least of his concerns. As the reality of his situation sank in, he found himself face to face with a truth that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He had just committed professional suicide in front of thousands of witnesses, and there was no way to take it back. The silence that followed Victoria's revelation stretched across the Diamond Lounge like a held breath. Brandon Mitchell stood frozen, the corporate documents still spread out on the table in front of him, his mind struggling to process the catastrophic scope of his mistake. Around him, dozens of passengers and staff members waited to see how he would respond to the discovery that he'd just tried to humiliate the woman who owned the airline. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing, instead of recognizing that he was standing at the edge of a professional cliff. Brandon Mitchell did something that sealed his fate completely. He doubled down. "This has to be fake," he said, his voice rising in pitch as desperation crept into his tone. "Anyone can print up official-looking documents. I've seen passengers try this kind of scam before claiming to be related to executives or board members to get special treatment." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Carlos Mendoza's TikTok audience, now approaching 150,000 live viewers, erupted in disbelief. The comments section scrolled so fast it was impossible to read individual messages, but the overall sentiment was clear. They were watching someone destroy their own career in real time. "He's calling her documents fake," Carlos whispered into his camera, hardly believing what he was witnessing. "Guys, I don't think this man understands what he's done." Jennifer Walsh's LinkedIn audience was having a more professional but equally shocked reaction. Senior executives from across the aviation industry were sharing the stream, with comments pouring in from people who personally knew Victoria Harrington and could confirm that the woman being accused of fraud was indeed exactly who she claimed to be. "That's definitely Victoria Harrington," typed the CEO of a major airline. "I've sat across from her in board meetings. Someone needs to get that manager away from a microphone immediately." "This is going to be the most expensive customer service mistake in aviation history," wrote a former FAA administrator. "I'm watching someone lose their job and their company lose millions in reputation damage." Victoria looked at Brandon with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Mitchell, these documents aren't fake. But if you have doubts about their authenticity, I encourage you to call Skyline Corporate and verify my identity." "That's exactly what I'm going to do," Brandon said, pulling out his phone with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to expose an elaborate deception. "Let's see how your fake story holds up when I get real corporate executives on the line." Amanda Foster watched in horror as her boss prepared to make what might be the most humiliating phone call in corporate history. She'd tried 3 times to get his attention to show him the Google search results that confirmed Victoria's identity, but Brandon was too focused on his own sense of righteous vindication to notice her increasingly frantic gestures. Isabella Garcia had given up on subtlety entirely. She walked directly to Brandon's side and spoke in an urgent whisper. "Mr. Mitchell, you need to stop this right now. I know who this woman is. She's telling the truth." Brandon waved her off dismissively. "Not now, Isabella. I'm about to expose this fraud once and for all." He was already dialing the corporate headquarters number, so confident in his position that he put the call on speakerphone for everyone in the lounge to hear. The phone rang twice before a professional voice answered. "Skyline Airways corporate headquarters. This is Samantha Pierce. How may I direct your call? This is Brandon Mitchell, manager of the Diamond Lounge at Miami International." Brandon said, his voice carrying across the silent lounge. "I have a passenger here claiming to be Victoria Harrington, the CEO. She's got some convincing fake documents, but I need corporate verification before I take any action." The pause on the other end of the line was long enough to make several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. When Samantha finally spoke, her voice carried a note of barely controlled shock. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? You said someone is claiming to be Dr. Harrington." "That's right," Brandon said, growing more confident. "She's got fake ID, fake corporate documents, even fake stock certificates. Pretty elaborate scam, but not elaborate enough to fool someone with my experience." Another pause. Then, "Mr. Mitchell, can you describe this passenger to me?" African-American woman, late 30s, wearing a black hoodie and jeans. Definitely not executive material. She's sitting in the Diamond Lounge, acting like she owns the place. The silence that followed was so complete that several passengers could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning system. Carlos adjusted his camera angle to capture both Brandon's confident expression and Victoria's increasingly amused one. When Samantha Pierce finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, But those who knew her well could hear the edge of panic underneath the professional tone. "Mr. Mitchell, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The woman you are describing is Dr. Victoria Harrington. She is the CEO and founder of this company. She is my boss, and she is your boss, and she is the boss of everyone who works for Skyline Airways. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The blood drained from Brandon's face so quickly that several passengers gasped. The phone slipped in his hand, and for a moment it looked like he might drop it entirely. That's not possible," he stammered. "The CEO wouldn't dress like that. She wouldn't travel without security or assistance or Dr. Harrington frequently travels incognito to assess customer service and operational standards." Samantha continued, her voice now carrying the tone of someone delivering a death sentence. "It's a well-known practice within the company. Every manager above regional level has been briefed on this policy." Brandon's legs seemed to give out slightly. He groped for a nearby chair and collapsed into it. The phone still on speaker, his face a mask of dawning horror. "Mr. Mitchell," Samantha continued, "are you still there?" "Yes," Brandon whispered. "I need to ask you directly, what actions have you taken regarding Dr. Harrington?" Brandon looked around the lounge, taking in the dozens of witnesses, the cameras, the phones recording every word of his professional destruction. I asked her to leave. You asked the CEO of the company to leave her own lounge. I didn't know. What else, Mr. Mitchell? What other actions have you taken?" Brandon's voice was barely audible. "I threatened to call security." The pause that followed was so long that several people wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Samantha finally spoke, her voice carried the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "Mr. Mitchell, by the authority vested in me as executive assistant to the CEO and with the full support of human resources and legal departments, you are hereby suspended from your position, effective immediately. Your access to company facilities is revoked, your corporate accounts are frozen, and you are to surrender your identification and company property to the senior staff member present." The words echoed across the Diamond Lounge like gunshots. Carlos's TikTok audience had grown to over 200,000 live viewers, making it one of the most watched real-time terminations in social media history. Jennifer's LinkedIn stream was being shared across corporate networks so quickly that it was breaking platform records for professional content engagement. "Suspended," Brandon said, his voice cracking. "You can't suspend me based on a phone call. I want to speak to my regional manager. I want to speak to HR. This isn't how these things work." Victoria Harrington, who had remained silent throughout Brandon's conversation with her assistant, finally spoke. "Mr. Mitchell, that was my executive assistant. I am your CEO, and you're not suspended." For a moment, Brandon's face lit up with hope. Maybe this was all some elaborate test. Maybe he could still salvage his career if he handled the next few moments correctly. But Victoria's next words destroyed any possibility of redemption. "You're fired." The two words hit the lounge like a physical impact. Several passengers audibly gasped. Carlos zoomed in on Brandon's face as the reality sank in. Jennifer's audience erupted in comments as aviation professionals processed what they'd just witnessed. Effective immediately, Victoria continued, her voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "Your access to Skyline Airways facilities is permanently revoked. Your final paycheck will be processed according to company policy. And I want to be very clear about something, Mr. Mitchell. This decision has nothing to do with a single conversation or a single mistake." Victoria stood up and addressed not just Brandon, but the entire lounge, her voice carrying to every corner of the space. "For the past hour, I have been subjected to discrimination based on my appearance and my race. I have been threatened with removal from a facility I have every right to access. I have been accused of fraud and deception, and all of this has taken place in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, and in front of the very passengers whose experience Mr. Mitchell was supposedly protecting. She turned back to Brandon, who sat slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. "This isn't about one bad day, Mr. Mitchell. This is about a pattern of behavior that has no place in my company. You've shown me exactly who you are, and I believe you. So now you get to live with the consequences of that choice." Brandon opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. What was there to say? How do you apologize for discrimination? How do you take back threats made in front of hundreds of witnesses? How do you undo the complete destruction of your own credibility? Kevin Thompson, who had been standing loyally beside Brandon throughout the entire confrontation, suddenly realized that his unwavering support for his boss's actions had probably cost him his job too. He looked around the lounge desperately, as if searching for some escape route from the disaster he'd helped create. Amanda Foster was already moving toward Brandon with a tablet in her hand. "I need your ID badge, company phone, and access cards," she said quietly. "I'm sorry it ended this way." Brandon looked at her with something approaching gratitude for the simple human kindness in her tone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his corporate ID, his company phone, and the magnetic access cards that had given him authority over the Diamond Lounge. As he handed them over, the physical act of surrendering the tools of his authority seemed to break the last of his resistance. He slumped forward in the chair, his head in his hands, the full weight of his professional destruction finally sinking in. Around him, the Diamond Lounge continued its Christmas Eve operations, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Staff members who had witnessed Brandon's downfall exchanged nervous glances, suddenly very aware that their own jobs depended on treating every passenger with dignity and respect. Passengers pulled out their phones to share what they'd witnessed, creating a social media storm that was already spreading far beyond the confines of Miami International Airport. And Victoria Harrington, the woman who had been told she didn't belong in her own lounge, sat back down in her chair and opened her tablet, returning to work as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something significant and irreversible. The consequences were just beginning. The aftermath of Victoria's revelation rippled through the Diamond Lounge like aftershocks from an earthquake. Brandon Mitchell sat in stunned silence, staring at the corporate ID badge in Amanda Foster's hands, as if it represented the last connection to a life that was already slipping away from him. Around him, the carefully orchestrated atmosphere of exclusive luxury had transformed into something resembling a crime scene, with witnesses' cameras and evidence of a career-ending mistake scattered across marble tables and leather chairs. Carlos Mendoza was now broadcasting to over 300,000 live viewers, his TikTok stream having evolved from a simple lounge review into what was arguably the most watched termination in social media history. The comments section had become a blur of reaction shares and increasingly sophisticated analysis as employment lawyers, business executives, and public relations experts joined the audience to witness the spectacle. "Holy shit," typed one viewer who identified himself as an HR director. "I'm showing this video in every management training session from now on." "This is textbook how to destroy your career in 18 minutes. This isn't just getting fired," wrote another. "This is getting fired so publicly that he'll never work in customer service again. This video is going to follow him for the rest of his life." "Someone needs to check on this guy," commented a third. "He looks like he's having a breakdown." Indeed, Brandon Mitchell appeared to be experiencing something approaching psychological collapse. The confident, authoritative manager who had approached Victoria Harrington less than an hour ago had been replaced by a man who seemed to be shrinking into himself, his expensive suit now looking like costume clothing on someone playing a role they no longer understood. Jennifer Walsh's LinkedIn audience had grown even more dramatically as the stream was shared across professional networks. Senior executives from major corporations were logging in to watch what many were already calling a masterclass in corporate accountability. The comments reflected a sophisticated understanding of the business implications of what they'd witnessed. "This is going to be required viewing in every business school in the country," typed the dean of a major MBA program. The speed with which this went from customer service issue to corporate crisis is breathtaking. The legal implications alone, wrote a corporate attorney, are staggering. Discrimination, hostile environment, abuse of authority. All documented in real time with hundreds of witnesses. This is a plaintiff's lawyer's dream case. But look at how the CEO handled it, observed a management consultant. She gave him every opportunity to back down. She warned him multiple times. This wasn't a trap. It was a test that he failed spectacularly. Victoria Harrington seemed remarkably composed for someone who had just terminated an employee in front of a global audience. She was responding to emails on her tablet, occasionally taking phone calls that were clearly related to the incident, but handled with the kind of efficient professionalism that suggested she'd dealt with similar situations before. But Victoria's calm demeanor masked the fact that she was simultaneously managing multiple crisis response protocols. Her executive assistant, Samantha Pierce, was coordinating with the legal department to ensure that Brandon's termination was documented properly and in accordance with all employment regulations. The public relations team was preparing statements for the inevitable media attention. The Human Resources Department was conducting emergency reviews of Brandon's employment history to identify any previous incidents that should have been escalated. Most importantly, Victoria was using this incident as a teaching moment for every Skyline Airways employee who would inevitably learn about it through corporate communications or social media. The message was simple and non-negotiable. Discrimination had consequences, authority without accountability was meaningless, and the company's values weren't just marketing slogans to be ignored when convenient. Antonio Rivera had finally connected with his supervisor, who was now racing to the Diamond Lounge with a team of corporate executives who understood the gravity of what had occurred. But they were operating on damage control protocols designed for typical customer service failures, not for situations where a manager had publicly humiliated the CEO of the company while being broadcast to hundreds of thousands of viewers. "This is unlike anything we've prepared for," Antonio's supervisor had told him over the phone. "We have protocols for angry passengers, medical emergencies, even security threats. But we don't have a protocol for what to do when a lounge manager commits career suicide in front of a live audience." Isabella Garcia was quietly beginning the process of transferring Brandon's managerial responsibilities to Amanda Foster, but she was also dealing with the practical implications of the incident. The Diamond Lounge was still operating, passengers still needed service, and the staff was understandably shaken by what they'd witnessed. Several employees had approached Isabella privately to ask whether their own jobs were secure, whether they might face similar consequences for past interactions with passengers. "Just treat everyone with respect," Isabella told them quietly. "That's all that's ever been expected." Mr. Mitchell's problem wasn't that he made a mistake. His problem was that he made a choice, a series of choices, and he kept making them even when he was given opportunities to stop. Amanda Foster was experiencing her own crisis of professional ethics. As the assistant manager, she had witnessed several instances of Brandon's discriminatory behavior over the past months, but company protocol had made it difficult to challenge a supervisor's decisions directly. Now she was being promoted to interim manager, by default inheriting responsibility for a facility that had just become the center of a global conversation about workplace discrimination. "I should have done more," she confided to Isabella. "I knew he was treating some passengers differently. I reported it, but I should have pushed harder when my complaints were dismissed." "You did what you could within the hierarchy," Isabella replied. "The system failed, not you. But now you have a chance to fix it." Kevin Thompson was having his own moment of reckoning. His uncritical support for Brandon's actions had been based on a simple belief that loyalty to management was always rewarded, that backing up your boss was the key to advancement. But watching Brandon's complete professional destruction had made Kevin realize that blind loyalty could be just as dangerous as direct insubordination. When Amanda approached him to discuss his role in the incident, Kevin was prepared for his own termination. Instead, he received what might have been a more valuable consequence, a direct conversation about the difference between supporting authority and supporting discrimination. You weren't making the decisions Amanda told him, but you were enabling them. The question is whether you understand why that was wrong and whether you're willing to do better. Kevin nodded, understanding that he was being given a second chance that his former boss would never receive. Meanwhile, passengers throughout the Diamond Lounge were processing what they'd witnessed in various ways. Some were sharing their own stories of discrimination in the comments of Carlos's stream, creating an impromptu forum for discussing workplace bias and customer service failures. Others were debating the ethics of public termination, questioning whether Brandon's mistake warranted such a public consequence. But the conversation that was emerging across social media platforms was more nuanced than simple celebration of Brandon's downfall. Employment experts were pointing out that Victoria had handled the situation exactly as corporate training manuals recommended. Multiple warnings, clear communication of expectations, documentation of policy violations, and swift action when behavior crossed legal and ethical lines. This wasn't revenge, typed one employment lawyer. This was accountability. And the reason it looks so dramatic is because we're not used to seeing accountability happen this quickly or this publicly. The CEO didn't humiliate this guy, wrote a business ethics professor. He humiliated himself. She just provided the consequences. Victoria's phone buzzed with an urgent call from her chief legal counsel. The conversation was brief but important, ensuring that Brandon's termination was handled according to all employment regulations, that his final paycheck and benefits were processed correctly, and that the company was prepared for any potential legal challenges that might arise from such a public firing. "Are we vulnerable to wrongful termination claims?" the lawyer asked. "Not with this level of documentation," Victoria replied. "We have hundreds of witnesses, multiple video recordings, and clear evidence of discriminatory behavior. If anything, we would have been vulnerable to discrimination lawsuits if we hadn't acted." As the legal and logistical aspects of the incident were being managed, Victoria was also dealing with the broader implications for Skyline Airways. The company's stock price was already responding to news of the incident, with investors trying to determine whether the viral video represented a crisis or an opportunity. Early analysis suggested that Victoria's decisive handling of the situation was being viewed positively by the market, with several analysts noting that swift action on discrimination issues was increasingly valued by consumers and shareholders. But Victoria wasn't focused on stock prices or market reactions. She was thinking about every Skyline Airways employee who would learn about this incident and understand that the company's commitment to equality wasn't just rhetoric. She was thinking about every passenger who had ever been made to feel unwelcome in a space they had paid to access. And she was thinking about her parents, whose dream of making aviation accessible and dignified for everyone was being honored in the most unexpected way. Brandon Mitchell remained seated in his chair, no longer the center of attention, but somehow still the focus of everyone's awareness. He had become a cautionary tale in real time, a case study in how quickly a career could be destroyed when personal bias overrode professional judgment. The countdown that Victoria had mentioned at the beginning of their confrontation had reached 0. Brandon's 18 minutes were up, and there was no possibility of overtime. While the drama in the Diamond Lounge continued to unfold, a parallel crisis was developing in Skyline Airways' corporate headquarters 45 miles away in downtown Miami. Samantha Pierce, Victoria's executive assistant, had activated what the company called Protocol 7, a comprehensive crisis response procedure designed for situations where the CEO's safety authority or corporate interests were under direct threat. What made this particular activation unusual was that the threat wasn't coming from external forces like hostile takeovers or regulatory investigations. The threat was internal, involving one of the company's own managers publicly humiliating the CEO while being broadcast to hundreds of thousands of viewers across multiple social media platforms. Samantha's first call after speaking with Brandon Mitchell had been to Marcus Chen Skyline's chief legal counsel, who was spending Christmas Eve with his family when his phone buzzed with an emergency alert. The message was brief but alarming: CEO confrontation at MIA Diamond Lounge. Manager terminated on live stream. Need immediate legal analysis and media response. "You've got to be kidding me," Marcus muttered as he stepped away from his family's Christmas dinner to handle what was rapidly becoming the most unusual employment law situation of his career. His second call was to Elena Rodriguez, the Chief Human Resources Officer, who was equally shocked to receive an emergency briefing about a manager being fired in real time, while hundreds of thousands of people watched on social media. "Let me understand this correctly," Elena said, reviewing the preliminary reports that Samantha was sending to her phone. Brandon Mitchell discriminated against Dr. Harrington, threatened to have her arrested, accused her of fraud, and did all of this while passengers were filming and streaming live to social media. "That's correct," Samantha replied. "And when I confirmed Dr. Harrington's identity during a speakerphone call, he continued to argue and refuse to accept reality." Elena was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "Samantha, this isn't just a termination. This is going to be a case study in employment law textbooks. The documentation alone. We have video evidence, audio recordings, hundreds of witnesses, and documented patterns of discriminatory behavior, all captured in real time." Meanwhile, the company's chief technology officer, David Park, was monitoring the social media impact of the incident. Carlos Mendoza's TikTok stream had become one of the platform's most watched live broadcasts, with viewer numbers approaching 500,000 and growing exponentially as the video was shared across other platforms. "We're trending on TikTok, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram," David reported during an emergency conference call with the other executives. The hashtags Skyline Accountability and Diamond Lounge Discrimination are both climbing toward the top of trending lists. This is going to be international news within hours. But David's analysis revealed something unexpected. The public reaction was overwhelmingly positive for Skyline Airways. Comments across platforms were praising Victoria's calm professionalism, her decision to give Brandon multiple opportunities to reconsider his actions, and the swift consequences that followed his refusal to change course. "This could have been a disaster," David continued, "but the narrative that's emerging is actually favorable to us. People are seeing this as accountability in action, not as a corporate overreach. Dr. Harrington's handling of the situation is being held up as a model for how executives should respond to discrimination." Back in the Diamond Lounge, the immediate crisis was being managed by Amanda Foster, who had suddenly found herself responsible for maintaining operations in a facility that had become the center of global attention. Her first priority was ensuring that other passengers continued to receive appropriate service, but her second priority was managing the aftermath of Brandon's termination. Isabella Garcia was helping Amanda navigate the complex logistics of removing Brandon's access to company resources. Every manager at Skyline Airways carried devices and credentials that provided access to sensitive customer information, flight operations data, and corporate communications. All of these needed to be deactivated immediately to prevent any potential security breaches or unauthorized access. His corporate email has been suspended. Isabella reported working from a checklist that she'd never expected to use under these circumstances. His access to the customer database is revoked. His authorization codes for lounge operations have been disabled, and security has been notified to update their access logs. But the most challenging aspect of the situation was managing Brandon himself. The man who had been confident and authoritative an hour earlier was now sitting in a chair, looking like he was in shock, staring at nothing, and occasionally mumbling responses to questions that no one had asked. "Should we call medical?" Amanda whispered to Isabella. "He doesn't look good." "I think he's just processing what happened," Isabella replied. "But let's keep an eye on him. Losing your job like this in front of this many people, that's traumatic." Kevin Thompson had appointed himself as Brandon's unofficial guardian, staying close to his former boss, and occasionally offering water or asking if he needed anything. It was a gesture of loyalty that surprised the other staff members, considering that Kevin's own job security was uncertain following his support for Brandon's discriminatory actions. "Why are you helping him?" Amanda asked Kevin quietly. "Because someone should," Kevin replied. "He made terrible choices, but he's still a person. And right now he looks like a person who needs help." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Antonio Rivera's supervisor regional manager Patricia Santos, along with a small team of corporate executives who had driven from headquarters as soon as they understood the scope of what had occurred. Patricia took one look at the scene, the cameras, the crowd, the obvious tension, and realized that this was far beyond anything her team was equipped to handle. "Where is Dr. Harrington?" Patricia asked Amanda. Amanda pointed to Victoria, who was sitting calmly in her chair, responding to emails and taking phone calls as if she were in her regular office, rather than at the center of a viral social media incident. Patricia approached Victoria with the kind of nervous energy that came from suddenly being responsible for managing a situation involving the CEO of the company. "Dr. Harrington, I'm Patricia Santos, the regional manager for this facility. I want to apologize for what happened here today, and I want to assure you that we're taking immediate action to address these issues." Victoria looked up from her tablet and gave Patricia a slight smile. "Hello, Patricia. I appreciate you coming down here, but this situation has been resolved. Mr. Mitchell has been terminated and Ms. Foster has been promoted to interim manager. What I need from you now is a comprehensive review of hiring and training procedures for customer-facing positions." Patricia nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. We'll begin immediately. Should we also conduct interviews with staff members who witnessed the incident?" "That won't be necessary," Victoria replied. "We have plenty of documentation. What I'm more interested in is preventing future incidents. I want to understand how someone with Mr. Mitchell's attitudes toward customer service was hired and promoted to a management position." The question hung in the air like an indictment. Patricia realized that she was being asked to explain not just Brandon's behavior, but the entire process that had allowed someone with discriminatory attitudes to gain authority over customer interactions. "We'll conduct a full review," Patricia promised. "Hiring practices, training protocols, performance evaluations, everything." "Good," Victoria said. "Because this incident tells me that we have gaps in our processes that need to be addressed immediately." While Patricia was receiving her assignment from Victoria, Carlos Mendoza was wrapping up what had become the most successful live stream of his career. His audience had peaked at over 600,000 concurrent viewers, with millions more watching recordings and clips that were being shared across every major social media platform. Guys, Carlos said to his camera, "I came here today to film a simple lounge review for Christmas week content. I never expected to document something like this. But I think there's an important lesson here about treating people with respect, regardless of how they're dressed or what you think you know about them." He paused, looking around the Diamond Lounge, which was slowly returning to normal operations despite the extraordinary circumstances. The CEO could have revealed her identity immediately. Carlos continued. She could have embarrassed that manager from the beginning. Instead, she gave him multiple chances to do the right thing. She warned him. She asked him to reconsider. She only took action when he refused to change course. That's not revenge. That's consequences. Carlos's analysis was being echoed across social media platforms by viewers who had watched the entire incident unfold. Employment lawyers were praising Victoria's handling of the situation. Business executives were using the incident as an example of decisive leadership, and ordinary people were sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination, often with comments about wishing their own employers had responded with similar swift action. Jennifer Walsh's LinkedIn audience was having a more professional discussion about the broader implications of the incident. The stream had been watched by executives from across the aviation industry, many of whom were now questioning their own company's training and accountability procedures. "This is going to change how we handle customer service training," typed the CEO of a major airline. The fact that this was broadcast live means every employee in the industry is going to see what happens when discrimination goes unchecked. "It's not just about training," replied a human resources executive. "It's about accountability. How many managers are out there right now treating customers badly because they think there won't be consequences?" The consequences here weren't just termination, observed a business school professor. The consequences were public professional destruction. This video is going to follow that manager for the rest of his career. Indeed, Brandon Mitchell's name was already being associated with the incident across multiple platforms. Employment law websites were using his case as an example of discriminatory behavior. Business ethics courses were preparing to use the video as a teaching tool. And human resources professionals were updating their training materials to include the incident as an example of how quickly customer service issues could become legal and public relations disasters. But perhaps the most significant impact was on Skyline Airways itself. The company's swift action, Victoria's professional handling of the situation, and the transparent nature of the consequences were being praised as a model for corporate accountability. Stock prices were actually rising as investors responded positively to what they saw as strong leadership and clear values. The process had been tested and it had responded exactly as designed. Discrimination had been met with consequences, authority had been held accountable, and the company's values had been demonstrated rather than just proclaimed. Brandon Mitchell's 18 minutes were over, but the impact would last much longer. As the immediate crisis in the Diamond Lounge stabilized, the ripple effects of Brandon Mitchell's career-ending encounter with Victoria Harrington were spreading far beyond the confines of Miami International Airport. What had begun as a local customer service incident was rapidly evolving into a global conversation about workplace discrimination, corporate accountability, and the power of social media to document and respond to injustice in real time. At Skyline Airways corporate headquarters, the executive team was managing multiple crisis response protocols simultaneously. The legal department was ensuring that all employment procedures had been followed correctly during Brandon's termination. The public relations team was preparing statements for the inevitable media inquiries. The human resources department was conducting emergency reviews of similar incidents that might have been inadequately addressed in other locations. But the most significant work was being done by the corporate communications team, led by Director Sarah Kim, who was tasked with turning what could have been a public relations disaster into a demonstration of company values. Sarah had spent the past hour reviewing the social media footage, legal implications, and market responses to determine the appropriate corporate messaging. "This is either going to be the worst or the best thing that's happened to our brand this year," Sarah told her team during an emergency video conference. The good news is that Dr. Harrington's handling of the situation has been almost universally praised. The bad news is that we're going to have to explain how someone like Brandon Mitchell was hired and promoted to a management position in the first place. Indeed, the corporate review that Patricia Santos had been tasked with was already revealing uncomfortable truths about gaps in Skyline's hiring and training procedures. Brandon's employment file showed several customer complaints that had been noted, but not escalated performance reviews that mentioned high standards without addressing discriminatory behavior and training records that indicated he had completed diversity and inclusion courses without apparently internalizing their lessons. "We have a pattern of incidents that were treated as isolated problems rather than symptoms of a larger issue," reported James Wilson, the Chief Human Resources Officer, during another emergency conference call. Brandon's behavior today wasn't an anomaly. It was the culmination of attitudes that we should have addressed months or even years ago. The revelation was forcing Skyline's leadership to confront uncomfortable questions about their own accountability. How many other managers were treating customers differently based on appearance? How many discrimination incidents had been dismissed as personality conflicts or management style differences? How many employees had reported concerns that were minimized or ignored? Back in the Diamond Lounge, Victoria was fielding calls from board members, investors, and industry colleagues who were responding to the viral videos with mixtures of shock, support, and curiosity about the company's next steps. But Victoria was also using the incident as an opportunity to gather information about similar problems throughout Skyline's operations. "I want to know about every customer complaint involving discrimination from the past 2 years," she told Samantha during one of their phone conversations. Every incident where passengers were treated differently because of race, religion, appearance, or any other factor unrelated to their ticket class or airline policies. "That's going to be a substantial review," Samantha warned. "Are you prepared for what we might find?" "I'm prepared to fix whatever we find," Victoria replied. "This incident with Brandon tells me that we have cultural problems that go beyond individual bad actors. If we're going to solve this, we need to understand the scope of the issue." Meanwhile, the social media storm surrounding the incident was taking on a life of its own. Carlos Mendoza's TikTok video had been viewed over 2 million times and shared across every major platform. The hashtag Skyline Accountability had become a trending topic worldwide, with people sharing their own experiences of discrimination in travel settings and praising Victoria's handling of the situation. But the response wasn't uniformly positive. Some critics were arguing that public termination was an overreaction, that Brandon deserved privacy during what was clearly a difficult personal moment, and that viral justice was a dangerous precedent for workplace accountability. "This is trial by social media," wrote one commenter on Jennifer Walsh's LinkedIn stream. "Yes, the manager was wrong, but did he deserve to have his life destroyed in front of hundreds of thousands of people?" "Nobody destroyed his life," replied another viewer. "His choices destroyed his life. The cameras just documented it." The debate was reflecting larger societal conversations about accountability, privacy, and the role of social media in documenting and responding to discrimination. Legal experts were discussing whether Brandon might have grounds for wrongful termination claims, while employment advocates were arguing that swift public consequences were necessary to demonstrate that discrimination wouldn't be tolerated. Victoria was aware of these debates, but she was focused on the internal changes that needed to happen at Skyline Airways. During a phone call with her Chief Operating Officer Michael Torres, she outlined a comprehensive response that would extend far beyond Brandon's termination. "We're implementing mandatory bias training for every customer-facing employee," Victoria told Michael. "Not the generic online courses we've been using, but intensive interactive workshops that address real scenarios and provide clear guidelines for appropriate behavior." "That's going to be expensive," Michael warned. "We're talking about thousands of employees across hundreds of locations. The cost of not doing it is higher," Victoria replied. "This incident is going to be studied in business schools and employment law courses for years. I want it to be studied as an example of how a company responds decisively to discrimination, not as a case study of corporate failure." The conversation was interrupted by Amanda Foster's approach in the Diamond Lounge. "Dr. Harrington, there's a situation developing with Mr. Mitchell that I think you should be aware of." Victoria looked up from her phone to see Brandon still sitting in the same chair where he'd received his termination, but now surrounded by passengers who were taking selfies and videos with him in the background. The man who had been confident and authoritative 2 hours earlier was now a reluctant celebrity, famous for making one of the most spectacularly documented career-ending mistakes in recent memory. "This isn't appropriate," Victoria said, standing up and addressing the passengers who were treating Brandon's humiliation as entertainment. "Mr. Mitchell made serious mistakes that resulted in his termination, but he's still a human being who deserves basic dignity." Victoria's intervention stopped the impromptu photo session, but it also demonstrated something important about her character that hadn't been fully apparent during the earlier confrontation. Even after being discriminated against and publicly challenged, she was unwilling to allow Brandon's suffering to become a source of entertainment. Sir Victoria said, approaching Brandon directly for the first time since his termination, "Do you have transportation to get home?" Brandon looked up at her with confusion and something that might have been gratitude. Yes." My car is in the employee parking garage. Good. I want you to know that your final paycheck will include severance pay according to company policy. Your health insurance will continue for 60 days. And if you need references for future employment that focus on your technical skills rather than this incident, you can have HR contact my office. The unexpected kindness seemed to break through Brandon's shock. His eyes filled with tears as the full weight of what he had lost, and what Victoria was still willing to provide, became clear. Why, he asked, quietly. After what I did to you, why would you help me? Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering her response carefully. Because how I treat you now says more about who I am than how you treated me earlier, said about who you are. You made terrible choices today, Mr. Mitchell, but you don't have to keep making them. The exchange was captured by Carlos's camera and several other phones in the lounge, adding another layer to a story that was already being analyzed and debated across social media platforms. Victoria's grace toward someone who had discriminated against her was being praised as leadership by some and criticized as enabling by others. But Victoria wasn't concerned about public opinion. She was thinking about her parents who had taught her that dignity wasn't something you only showed to people who deserved it. She was thinking about her company, which needed to demonstrate that accountability and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. And she was thinking about every employee and passenger who would hear about this incident and need to understand that mistakes had consequences, but that people could still choose to do better. Antonio Rivera, who had been watching the entire situation unfold with the perspective of someone who understood both aviation culture and corporate hierarchy, approached Victoria as Brandon was finally escorted from the lounge by security personnel. Dr. Harrington Antonio said, "I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner. I recognized you when you first arrived, but I wasn't sure about the appropriate protocol for intervention." Victoria nodded. "You were in a difficult position, Antonio, but I appreciate you speaking up when you did. That showed integrity. Will this change anything about how we handle these situations in the future?" "Everything," Victoria replied. "We're going to make sure that every employee understands not just what our policies are, but why they matter. And we're going to create processes that make it easier for people to speak up when they see discrimination happening." As Brandon's departure marked the end of the immediate crisis. The Diamond Lounge was slowly returning to normal operations, but normal had been redefined by what had occurred. Staff members were treating every passenger with extra attention and courtesy. Passengers were more aware of how they spoke to service workers, and everyone understood that they were part of a space where accountability was real and consequences were swift. The Christmas tree lights continued to twinkle. The jazz music resumed its subtle background presence, and the conversation returned to holiday travel plans and business meetings. But the Diamond Lounge would never be the same. It had been transformed from a place where discrimination could hide behind authority into a space where dignity was genuinely non-negotiable. The 18 minutes that had destroyed Brandon Mitchell's career had also created something new. A workplace culture where respect wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. And that transformation, Victoria knew, was worth all the discomfort and controversy that had made it possible. The moment of revelation had passed, but its echoes continued to reverberate through the Diamond Lounge like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water. Brandon Mitchell was gone, escorted from the premises by security personnel who handled his departure with the kind of professional courtesy he had failed to show Victoria Harrington. The chair where he had sat in stunned silence after his termination was now empty, but the space somehow still carried the weight of what had occurred there. Victoria Harrington remained in her original seat, the same chair where Brandon had first approached her with his condescending assumption that she didn't belong. But everything else had changed. The atmosphere in the lounge was different, charged with the electricity that follows significant events when people realize they've witnessed something that will be discussed and analyzed for years to come. Carlos Mendoza was concluding his TikTok stream, which had become the most watched live broadcast in his career. His audience had peaked at nearly 800,000 concurrent viewers, with millions more watching clips and recordings across every major social media platform. The comments section had evolved from simple reactions to sophisticated discussions about corporate accountability, workplace discrimination, and the power of social media to document justice in real time. What we've witnessed here today, Carlos told his camera, isn't just about one manager making a mistake or one CEO responding to discrimination. This is about consequences, about accountability, about what happens when someone's true character is revealed under pressure. He paused, looking around the Diamond Lounge, which was slowly returning to its normal rhythm of quiet luxury and holiday travel. The CEO could have embarrassed that manager from the beginning. She could have played the "do you know who I am" card immediately. Instead, she gave him chance after chance to do the right thing. She warned him. She asked him to reconsider. She only revealed her identity when it became clear that he wasn't going to change course. Carlos's analysis was being shared across platforms by viewers who had watched the entire incident unfold. His video had become more than entertainment. It was evidence in what employment lawyers were already calling one of the most thoroughly documented cases of workplace discrimination in recent history. Jennifer Walsh's LinkedIn audience was having equally sophisticated discussions about the broader implications of the incident. Her stream had been watched by thousands of business executives, human resources professionals, and industry leaders who were now questioning their own company's protocols for handling discrimination. This is going to change how we think about customer service training, typed one Fortune 500 CEO. The fact that this was broadcast live means every employee in America is going to understand that discrimination has immediate public consequences. "It's not just about training," replied a university business professor. "This is a case study in leadership under pressure." Watch how the CEO handled every stage of this confrontation. She gave multiple warnings, documented everything, and only escalated when the manager refused to change his behavior. Victoria was reading some of these comments on her tablet, but she wasn't focused on the social media reaction. She was thinking about the broader changes that needed to happen at Skyline Airways to prevent similar incidents in the future. This confrontation with Brandon had revealed gaps in hiring, training, and accountability that extended far beyond one problematic manager. Samantha Victoria said during another phone call with her executive assistant, "I want you to schedule a company-wide video conference for December 26th. Every manager, every supervisor, every team leader. I want to address this incident directly and outline the changes we're implementing." "What should I tell them about the agenda?" Samantha asked. "Tell them we're discussing accountability expectations and the difference between authority and leadership. Tell them that what happened today was unacceptable, but it's also an opportunity for us to recommit to our values." Amanda Foster approached Victoria's table with a tablet containing reports about the lounge's operations during the crisis. Despite the extraordinary circumstances, the Diamond Lounge had continued to serve passengers, manage flight connections, and maintain the level of service that justified its premium pricing. Dr. Harrington, Amanda said, "I want to thank you for the promotion to interim manager, and I want to assure you that this kind of incident won't happen again under my leadership." Victoria looked at Amanda with the kind of steady gaze that made people understand they were being evaluated on multiple levels. "Amanda, I promoted you not just because Brandon was terminated, but because you recognized that his behavior was wrong and you tried to intervene. That shows judgment and courage." "I should have done more earlier," Amanda replied. "I reported some of his previous incidents, but I should have pushed harder when my complaints weren't taken seriously." "That's exactly why we're implementing new reporting procedures," Victoria said. "No one should have to choose between their job security and their ethical obligations. When someone reports discrimination, it needs to be investigated thoroughly and addressed decisively." Isabella Garcia joined the conversation carrying a folder of documents that represented the practical aftermath of Brandon's termination. "Dr. Harrington, we've completed the security protocol updates. All of Mr. Mitchell's access codes have been deactivated. his corporate accounts have been suspended, and his authorization to represent Skyline Airways in any capacity has been revoked. But Isabella was also carrying something else, a collection of customer feedback forms and complaint reports that painted a troubling picture of Brandon's management style. The documents revealed a pattern of incidents where passengers had been treated differently based on appearance, accent, or perceived economic status. "This is worse than we thought," Isabella said quietly, showing Victoria the reports. "There have been at least a dozen formal complaints about discriminatory behavior in the past 6 months, plus several informal reports that weren't properly documented." Victoria reviewed the documents with the kind of careful attention that revealed her background in both business management and aerospace engineering. She was looking for patterns, connections, and evidence that would help her understand not just what had happened, but why it had been allowed to continue. "This represents a failure at multiple levels," Victoria said finally. "Brandon's individual behavior, inadequate training programs, insufficient oversight, and a culture that allowed discrimination to be dismissed as personality conflicts or management style differences. The revelation that Brandon's behavior had been problematic for months rather than just today was spreading through the lounge staff with the kind of whispered conversations that occur when people realize they've been complicit in something they should have challenged more aggressively. Antonio Rivera, who had finally been relieved of his conflicted position as a witness to his CEO's humiliation, approached Victoria with his own perspective on the broader implications of the incident. "Dr. Harrington Antonio said this is going to change how every Skyline employee thinks about customer service. Not just because of the policies, but because everyone is going to know that discrimination has immediate public consequences." "That's exactly what I want," Victoria replied. "I want every employee to understand that our company values aren't just marketing slogans. They're operating principles that will be enforced regardless of someone's position or seniority." As the afternoon progressed and the immediate crisis stabilized, Victoria was already planning the comprehensive response that would transform this incident from a public relations disaster into a demonstration of corporate accountability. She was thinking about the training programs that needed to be redesigned, the hiring procedures that required updating the reporting processes that had failed to escalate Brandon's problematic behavior. But she was also thinking about the thousands of Skyline Airways employees who would learn about this incident through corporate communications, social media, or news coverage. The message needed to be clear. Discrimination wasn't just wrong, it was career-ending. Authority without accountability was meaningless, and the company's commitment to dignity and respect wasn't negotiable. The Christmas lights on the massive tree continued to twinkle, casting warm reflections across the marble floors and leather chairs. The Diamond Lounge had returned to its atmosphere of quiet luxury, but it had been fundamentally changed by what had occurred. It was no longer just an exclusive space for premium passengers. It had become a symbol of accountability in action. Victoria's 18-minute countdown had expired, but the consequences would last much longer. Brandon Mitchell's career was over, but something new had been born. A workplace culture where respect was genuinely non-negotiable and where discrimination would face swift, decisive consequences. The revelation was complete, but the transformation was just beginning. The immediate aftermath of Brandon Mitchell's termination moved with the kind of efficiency that only crisis management protocols could provide. Victoria Harrington's decision to fire him had been swift and decisive, but the practical implementation of that decision required coordination between multiple departments, adherence to employment regulations, and careful attention to legal requirements that would protect both the company and Brandon's basic rights as a terminated employee. Amanda Foster found herself managing the operational details of removing a manager from a facility that had become the center of global attention. Her promotion from assistant manager to interim manager had occurred in front of hundreds of witnesses and thousands of online viewers, creating a level of scrutiny that few workplace transitions ever experienced. Isabella Amanda said consulting the emergency protocols manual that she'd never expected to use under these circumstances. We need to secure Mr. Mitchell's office, transfer his active projects to other staff members, and update all systems to reflect the change in management structure. Isabella Garcia nodded, but she was also thinking about the human elements of the situation that couldn't be addressed through corporate procedures. Amanda. The staff is shaken. They've watched their manager get fired in real time while being broadcast to the world. Some of them are worried about their own job security. It was a legitimate concern. Kevin Thompson, in particular, was experiencing the kind of anxiety that comes from realizing that his uncritical support for Brandon's discriminatory actions had put his own employment at risk. He'd spent the past hour replaying every interaction, every moment when he could have spoken up or questioned Brandon's decisions, every opportunity he'd missed to demonstrate that he understood the difference between loyalty and complicity. Kevin Amanda called him over. "I need you to know that your job isn't in jeopardy because you supported Mr. Mitchell's decisions. But going forward, I need you to understand that supporting authority means supporting the right decisions, not just supporting whoever happens to be in charge." Kevin nodded eagerly, grateful for the clarity and the second chance. "I understand. I was wrong to think that backing up my supervisor automatically meant I was doing the right thing." "Exactly," Amanda replied. "Your job is to provide excellent customer service and to support policies that reflect our company values. When those two things conflict with a supervisor's instructions, you need to choose values." Meanwhile, Victoria was handling the broader corporate implications of the incident. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from board members, investors, industry colleagues, and media representatives who were trying to understand the scope of what had occurred and its potential impact on Skyline Airways. The conversation that required her most careful attention was with Robert Harrison, the chairman of Skyline's board of directors, who was calling from his family's Christmas Eve celebration in Denver. "Victoria, Robert said, I've been watching the social media coverage and I want to make sure we're handling this situation appropriately. Terminating an employee so publicly, even for cause, creates potential legal and public relations risks," Robert Victoria replied. "I understand your concerns, but this wasn't a case where private correction was possible. Mr. Mitchell's behavior was discriminatory, public, and documented by multiple cameras. Any response that didn't include immediate termination would have sent the message that discrimination is tolerable, as long as it's not too obvious." Robert was quiet for a moment, processing Victoria's analysis. As chairman, he was responsible for protecting the company's interests, but he was also aware that Victoria's reputation for decisive leadership was one of Skyline's most valuable assets. "What's the legal exposure?" Robert asked. "Minimal," Victoria replied. "Marcus Chen has reviewed the documentation and we have overwhelming evidence of discriminatory behavior, insubordination, and violation of multiple company policies. If anything, we would have been more legally vulnerable if we hadn't taken action." The conversation was interrupted by another call that Victoria needed to take immediately. Marcus Chen himself was calling with updates about the legal review that had been conducted in parallel with the public termination. Victoria Marcus said, "I've completed my analysis of the incident and I want to confirm that the termination was legally sound. We have video evidence, audio recordings, multiple witnesses, and a pattern of previous complaints that support the decision. Brandon's behavior today wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a series of problems that should have been addressed more aggressively." "What about potential wrongful termination claims?" Victoria asked. "Virtually impossible to sustain," Marcus replied. "The documentation is overwhelming. The witnesses are numerous, and the behavior was clearly discriminatory. Any employment lawyer who took that case would be doing their client a disservice." But Marcus also had concerns about the broader implications of such a public termination. "Victoria, this incident is going to be studied in employment law courses for years. We need to make sure that our response demonstrates not just swift justice, but also appropriate consideration for due process and employee rights." "What do you recommend?" Victoria asked. Full documentation of everything that led to this decision. Clear communication about company policies and expectations, and transparency about the changes we're implementing to prevent similar incidents in the future. While Victoria was managing the corporate response, the social media storm surrounding the incident was reaching new heights. Carlos Mendoza's TikTok video had been viewed over 5 million times and shared across every major platform. The hashtag Skyline Accountability was trending worldwide, with people sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination and praising Victoria's swift response. But the incident was also generating debate about the appropriateness of viral justice and public termination. Some commenters argued that Brandon deserved privacy during his professional downfall, while others maintained that public discrimination required public consequences. "This is what accountability looks like," wrote one employment law expert on Twitter. "Clear expectations, documented warnings, swift consequences when lines are crossed. But this is someone's life being destroyed in real time," replied another commenter. "Yes, he was wrong, but did it have to be so public? He made it public when he discriminated against someone in front of cameras," countered a third. "The consequences are public because the actions were public." Victoria was aware of these debates, but she was focused on ensuring that the incident became a catalyst for positive change rather than just a moment of viral entertainment. During a call with Sarah Kim, her director of corporate communications, she outlined the messaging strategy that would define Skyline's response. Sarah Victoria said, "I want our statement to focus on 3 key points. Discrimination is unacceptable, accountability is immediate, and we're implementing changes to prevent future incidents. This isn't about punishing one individual. It's about demonstrating our commitment to our values. The media is going to want exclusive interviews," Sarah warned. "Every major news outlet is calling for comment." "Schedule them," Victoria replied. "I want to be clear about what happened, why we responded the way we did, and what changes we're implementing. Transparency is our best defense against speculation and misinformation." As the immediate crisis moved into its management phase, the Diamond Lounge itself was being transformed by the incident. Passengers who had witnessed Brandon's termination were sharing the story with other travelers, creating ripple effects throughout the airport. Staff members from other airlines were discussing the incident during shift changes, and airport management was reviewing their own policies for handling discrimination complaints. But perhaps the most significant change was occurring within Skyline Airways itself. News of the incident was spreading through the company's internal communication channels, with employees sharing the viral videos and discussing the implications for their own work environments. Flight attendants were talking about passenger interactions that they'd previously tolerated but would now challenge. Gate agents were reviewing their training on appropriate customer service. Managers were questioning whether their own departments had adequately addressed discrimination complaints. "This changes everything," one Skyline employee wrote on the company's internal message board. "Now we know that discrimination has immediate consequences regardless of someone's position or seniority." "It's not just about consequences," replied another. "It's about clarity. We all know exactly what the expectations are, and what happens when those expectations aren't met." The swift justice that had followed Brandon's discriminatory behavior was creating cultural change that extended far beyond a single termination. It was establishing new norms, new expectations, and new standards for how Skyline Airways employees interacted with customers and colleagues. Victoria's 18-minute countdown had resulted in more than just one manager losing his job. It had created a case study in accountability that would influence corporate culture and employment practices for years to come. The justice had been swift, but its impact would be lasting. As Christmas Eve afternoon stretched into evening, the Diamond Lounge had settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and fundamentally changed. The marble floors still gleamed under the soft lighting, the Christmas tree still cast its warm glow across the seating areas, and passengers still moved through the space with the quiet confidence that came from accessing exclusive amenities. but everyone who had witnessed Brandon Mitchell's spectacular professional downfall understood that something significant had shifted in the culture of the place. Victoria Harrington remained in her original chair, the same spot where Brandon had first approached her with his condescending assumptions about who belonged in premium spaces. She was responding to emails and taking phone calls related to the incident, but she was also observing the subtle changes in how staff members interacted with passengers and how passengers treated the people serving them. The transformation was most evident in Amanda Foster, who had evolved from nervous assistant manager to confident interim leader in the space of 2 hours. She was moving through the lounge with purposeful energy, checking on passengers, coordinating with staff, and managing operations with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she understood the weight of her new responsibilities. Dr. Harrington. Amanda approached Victoria's table with a tablet containing operational reports. I wanted to update you on how we're handling the transition. All of Mr. Mitchell's ongoing projects have been reassigned. His access credentials have been fully revoked, and the staff has been briefed on new protocols for reporting any concerns about customer interactions. Victoria looked up from her phone and gave Amanda the kind of steady, evaluative gaze that made people understand they were being assessed on multiple levels. Amanda, what I saw today wasn't just you following protocols. You tried to warn Mr. Mitchell about his mistakes. You attempted to intervene when his behavior became inappropriate, and you maintained your integrity even when it would have been easier to stay silent. I should have done more earlier, Amanda replied, echoing the conversation they'd had immediately after Brandon's termination. I knew there were problems with how he treated certain passengers. You did what you could within the constraints of the system, Victoria said. But now you're in a position to change that process. I'm not just promoting you because Mr. Mitchell was terminated. I'm promoting you because you've demonstrated judgment, courage, and commitment to our actual values, rather than just our stated policies. The conversation was interrupted by Isabella Garcia, who approached with a young woman Victoria didn't immediately recognize. Dr. Harrington. This is Maria Santos, one of our customer service representatives. She wanted to speak with you about something important. Maria looked nervous but determined as she addressed Victoria directly. Dr. Harrington, I witnessed what happened today, and I wanted you to know that Mr. Mitchell's behavior wasn't unusual. There have been other incidents where passengers were treated differently based on how they looked or spoke, but complaints weren't taken seriously when they were reported. Victoria set down her tablet and gave Maria her full attention. Tell me more about these other incidents. Maria glanced at Isabella and Amanda for support before continuing. 3 months ago, a Middle Eastern family was questioned extensively about their boarding passes, even though everything was in order. Last month, a young black man was asked to move to a different seating area because another passenger complained about his music, even though he was wearing headphones and you could barely hear anything. And there were several times when passengers with accents were assumed to need extra help or weren't taken seriously when they made service requests. The revelations confirmed what Victoria had suspected. Brandon's discrimination against her wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior that had been tolerated, minimized, or ignored. The process had failed not just in hiring someone with discriminatory attitudes, but in allowing those attitudes to influence customer interactions for months or years. Maria Victoria said, "Thank you for having the courage to speak up now. These incidents should have been escalated immediately, and the fact that they weren't tells me we have problems beyond individual bad actors." Victoria pulled out her phone and placed a call to James Wilson, the Chief Human Resources Officer. James, I need you to initiate a comprehensive review of discrimination complaints across all customer service positions. I want to know about every incident that was reported and not properly addressed. Every pattern of behavior that was dismissed as personality conflicts, and every failure of our oversight procedures. The call lasted several minutes, but Victoria made sure that Maria could hear the conversation. She wanted every employee to understand that discrimination complaints would now be taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, and addressed decisively. When Victoria ended the call, she looked back at Maria with an expression that conveyed both appreciation and determination. Your willingness to speak up today is going to help prevent future incidents. But I also want you to know that you shouldn't have had to wait for the CEO to be personally discriminated against before feeling safe to report these problems. Carlos Mendoza had been preparing to leave the lounge for his own flight, but the conversation between Victoria and Maria prompted him to approach their table with his camera still recording. His audience had dropped from its peak of 800,000 concurrent viewers, but several 100,000 people were still watching as the incident moved from crisis to resolution. Dr. Harrington Carlos said, "Can I ask you something for my audience? A lot of people are saying that firing someone so publicly was too harsh, that Mr. Mitchell deserved privacy during what was clearly a difficult moment for him." Victoria considered the question carefully before responding. Carlos' discrimination isn't a private matter when it happens in public spaces. Mr. Mitchell's behavior affected not just me, but every passenger who witnessed it and every employee who was expected to support it. The consequences were public because the actions were public. She paused, looking around the lounge at the staff members and passengers who were listening to her response. But I also want to be clear about something else. This incident wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about accountability. Mr. Mitchell was given multiple opportunities to reconsider his approach, to step back from discriminatory behavior and to treat a customer with basic dignity. He chose to escalate instead of de-escalate. Those were his choices, and consequences followed from those choices. Carlos nodded, understanding that he was documenting something more significant than just a customer service dispute. What message do you want other business leaders to take from this incident? That discrimination is expensive, Victoria replied without hesitation. It's expensive in legal costs, reputation damage, employee turnover, and customer loyalty. But most importantly, it's expensive in human terms. The cost of making people feel unwelcome in spaces they have every right to access. Jennifer Walsh had also delayed her departure to witness the resolution of the incident she'd been broadcasting to her LinkedIn audience. As a tech journalist, she'd covered numerous corporate crises and CEO responses, but Victoria's handling of the situation struck her as unusually authentic and decisive. Dr. Harrington Jennifer said this incident is going to be studied in business schools and employment law courses. What do you want those students to learn from how you handled this situation? Victoria smiled slightly, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd shown since Brandon had first approached her hours earlier. I want them to learn that authority without accountability is meaningless, that leadership means protecting people who can't protect themselves, and that company values are only as strong as your willingness to enforce them when it's difficult or inconvenient. As the afternoon light began to fade outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Diamond Lounge was preparing for the evening rush of international departures. The Christmas tree lights seemed brighter in the growing darkness, and the soft jazz music provided a soundtrack for conversations about holiday plans and family reunions. But the atmosphere had been permanently changed by what had occurred. Staff members were treating every passenger with extra attention and courtesy. Passengers were more aware of how they spoke to service workers, and everyone understood that they were part of a space where dignity was genuinely non-negotiable. Victoria gathered her belongings and prepared to board her flight to London, where she would spend Christmas with colleagues who were working to expand Skyline Airways' international operations. But before leaving, she took a final look around the lounge that had become the setting for one of the most thoroughly documented cases of workplace accountability in recent memory. The 18 minutes that had destroyed Brandon Mitchell's career had also created something new. A workplace culture where respect wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. Where authority was balanced by accountability. Where the company's stated values aligned with its actual practices. The emotional resolution was complete, but the transformation would continue long after Victoria's flight departed for London. 2 months later, Victoria returned to the Diamond Lounge during another unannounced visit. Amanda Foster, now permanent manager, greeted her warmly alongside a completely retrained staff. The lounge had been redesigned with diverse artwork and welcoming messaging, and customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Victoria smiled, ordered her usual coffee, and opened her tablet to review designs for Skyline's new fleet of eco-friendly aircraft. The incident with Brandon Mitchell had become a catalyst for company-wide reforms that extended far beyond a single airport lounge. Meanwhile, Brandon Mitchell was finishing his shift at a budget car rental counter near Fort Lauderdale Airport. After being blacklisted from the aviation industry, he'd struggled to find work matching his previous salary. The news played silently on the waiting room TV, featuring Skyline Airways receiving another Diversity and Inclusion Award. He finally understood that true professionalism had nothing to do with someone's appearance and everything to do with treating people with dignity. His 18 minutes of discrimination had cost him everything, but perhaps taught him something more valuable than his previous position had ever provided. Victoria's experience became a case study in business schools nationwide, not as a revenge story, but as proof that authentic leadership means protecting those who can't protect themselves. The Diamond Lounge incident led to industry-wide reforms in customer service training, and Victoria's foundation had already awarded scholarships to over 200 students from underrepresented communities pursuing careers in aviation. Sometimes it only takes 18 minutes to change an entire industry's altitude, and the ripple effects of that December afternoon continued to reshape workplace cultures across the corporate world. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your engagement helps stories like this reach people who might be facing similar situations in their own workplaces. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about dignity, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. And remember, respect costs nothing, but discrimination costs everything. Until next time, keep treating people with the dignity they deserve, because you never know who might be watching. Thank you for joining us today.
Ну тогда печально, что так
Хочешь ха-ха?
Все.
Да?
Хочу кушать.
Что?
Хочу кушать.
Короче, Палестина тоже помогает.
Да?
Представь?
Серьезно?
Палестина, которой нужна самой помощь, помогает нам.
Нормально. Чечня, там я видел много.
Ингушетия, Кабардино-Балкария.
Что-то столько там машины, там я видел КамАЗы из Чечни, понял, там 300 КамАЗов или сколько. Ну, я образно там преувеличивал, может быть. Ну, все, короче, едут помогать. Казахстан тоже помогает, я видел там. Ну, все помогают. Просто разными способами. Кто-то гуманитарку, кто-то деньги, кто-то вот огласку, кто-то там помощь, рабочую силу, поняли, там людей по-разному.
Ну, пацаны, машины бесплатно чинят.
Да, вот. Зима. Там есть люди, которые... Ну, там много чего происходит. Там же машин, да и затоплено сколько. Там с химчистку, все вот это, все.
ГМА повоз привезли к себе в Ростов машины.
Да. Кто-кто?
ГМА детали.
ГМА?
Один из самых первых известных, мне кажется.
Красава.
Энергия Бакинская, Associations.
Твое, да? Ящица. Джон, настолько голодный ты, брат? Ау, ты бакинская яичница, ты башаншок. Ау, как
Можно?
вкусно.
Лепешки что-нибудь.
Такое нельзя на диете есть, да?
Это яйца, помидоры.
Знаешь, чем он белый?
Соусом.
Что?
7-8.
Какой? Знаете, у Сэма где он?
Ты пишешь красавный, я думаю, может, Ромский едет.
Мы тебе в Обширон с бабуликами приедем скоро. Бабуликами? Давайте к Немату поедем. На рыбалку. Есть рыбалка нормально?
Так, можно сделать стрим, когда вы приедете, когда это будет примерно.
Конец апреля.
Ну вот, конец апреля, да.
Как раз мы туда вернемся. Я возьму эндуро, Сэм возьмет эндуро, мы отвезем. Мы приедем, мы сделаем плов, покатаемся на эндуро. С паханом посидим такой.
Пойдем. Базар.
Поломаем ногу. Газ.
Базар.
Течет кровь по венам, венам.
Тут темно просто, поэтому я могу вот так сделать, но просто чесать будет неудобно, понял, нам все. Так. Могу вот так вообще сделать. Да, как вам видно?
Сейчас только на телефоне.
Сейчас только на телефоне. Я посмотрю сюда. Так лучше?
Спасибо. Всем, кто хавает, тоже приятно.
Микрофон поменяю.
А здесь вообще интернет, да, не работает? Я понял.
Бля, мне одному холодно, нет?
Может, ты заболел, братиш?
Нет. Мне можно плед, брат? То есть, в этих, понял? Кроксов, блядь, пришел.
Как вот эта дверь открывается, меня
Без носков.
начинает, да, дружки даже.
Покажи мне диктатор Мбаппе.
Братиш, что это такое? Ты не знаешь этот мем, блядь?
Ну, может, видел, ага.
Уже со мной такой мем делали, да?
Эй, Лисан,
Я не знаю.
Лисян,
Лисан,
иди. Вот он есть.
Лисяну брать? 01 регион? Ух. Да, не работает, ты кто это? Да, не работает.
Ну, тоже.
Да, в смысле,
Не багаж?
честно, я не работаю в таких VPN. Спасибо.
А что там, типа, смешно или же?
Бля, ну это смешно. ТикТок. Спасибо. Что вы? Я, короче, я ставку поставил.
Какую?
Обе забьют и победа Баварии. Но я говорю, я ставлю
Символьно.
сердцем, не головой. Понял? Поэтому это такая опасность.
Я бы тоже бы поставил обе забьют, но Реал победа.
3-8 очень хорошая ставка. Это хорошие ставки, но
3-8 на Баварию победу?
3,6 на Баварию, 3,8, ну вот такая ставка.
Да,
То есть Реал андердог идет?
Ну, на чуть-чуть совсем. Ну, блядь. Знаешь, что мне кажется? Это один из таких матчей, где может быть всего один гол, знаешь? Такое бывает. Где 1-1, вот 1-0 закончится. Такое может быть.
А ебани просто еще ставку 2,5 меньше. Потому что 2,5 больше, кэф 1,3 всего лишь. А прикинь, 2,5 меньше, какой там кэф будет. Потому что до 3 голов будет матч. Сейчас я даже скажу, что кэф там будет 2,5 меньше.
1-9.
Смотри, как начнет играть. Видишь, если будет открыто играть, то да, большой счет будет. Потому что в Баварии высокая атака, оборона отстает. Реал от обороны
Брат,
контратак
2,5
хороший.
меньше, 3,2.
Много голов может быть.
2,5.
Меньше.
Может эти команды
До 3 голов. Что?
оборону будут
много.
долго. И будет мало. Короче, непонятно. Это
Ну, вообще веришь, что на голов мы забивают?
непонятно.
Очень дохуя.
Я тоже так думаю.
Очень много дают.
Я сегодня меня Сэм будет драконить очень. Я вот... Сэм, это понял? Глор, который просто драконит, понял?
Ну, вообще, он за какую команду болеет одну?
Я понял. Он заболеет всегда против меня.
Да. Чтобы интересно было.
Он сегодня меня очень драконит будет. Осуждаю.
Ну, Бавария сильна, пиздец.
Да. Но
Ну, магия
есть
Реал
проблемы.
Мадрид.
Да, вот это
Магия. Бернабео.
Бернабеу ебаная, да.
Магия тут рост была. Почти.
Есть еще железная бетонная ставка, как комбо ставка. Обе забьют, 2,5 больше.
Хуйня.
Сегодня наш Вальвердик. Мбаппе. Сегодня полный состав, по-моему.
Я не
будет.
боюсь Мбаппе, я боюсь от двух игроков. Винни, он сильный, реально сейчас. И Вальверде. Все, мне на остальных вообще клаун, я понял. Мне не страшно, ни один игрок был. В реале два игрока, которые делают разницу, реально.
Рюдигер придет на стандарт и с головы забьет.
Рюдигер, блядь, это не против Холода играть, там Кейн будет, блядь. Вот Федя козел, да, молодец, хороший. Реально хороший футболист.
Знаешь,
где ставишь,
что судья, который будет судить, он говорит, ребят,
Братан, знаю, слышал,
Вот, покажи ему.
слышал я этого судью. Я
Братан,
скрипнул,
вот где ставить надо, братан.
Тихо, тихо, брат, бэтбум, брат.
на Бомбей хорош. Что за свинья лысая? Ребят,
А я тут что?
Я понял, чего хочу больше всего, чтобы была ничья, 1-1. Я на ответной игре просто лям ебашу.